Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. And may the peace, mercy, and blessings of Allah be upon you. Imagine a Catholic priest with a devoted flock, or a Jewish rabbi deeply embedded in a centuries-old community, or even a Hindu priest born into a strict revered caste. One Tuesday, they don't just, resign from their job.
Right, they don't just put in their 2 weeks' notice.
Exactly. They decide to completely dismantle their deeply entrenched spiritual, professional, and social identity to face Mecca and pray. Today, we are opening a massive stack of your sources to look at the ultimate paradigm shift.
It really is one of the most drastic psychological and sociological pivots a human being can make. You have to understand, for a religious leader, you aren't just changing your mind about a philosophical concept. You are actively tearing up the social contract of your entire life.
Yeah, your whole livelihood.
Your income, your lifelong friendships, the automatic respect you command in your community, your very sense of self, all of it is suddenly put on the chopping block, and usually for a faith that your native community actively distrusts.
And the mission for our deep dive today is to really get into the hidden gears of how this actually happens. Because this isn't just about everyday people changing their minds because they read an interesting book or married someone of a different faith.
No, the stakes are way higher here.
Way higher. We are unpacking the highly complex psychological, theological, and sociological mechanisms that cause lifelong experts in one faith to switch to another. We'll look impartially at the driving forces, the specific verses that act as magnets, the modern digital infrastructure supporting these shifts, and the fierce debates surrounding them.
And we are just the messengers here.
Right. We're looking at the data, the testimonies, and the academic research you provided to understand the why and the how. We aren't endorsing any specific theological viewpoint today. We are strictly analyzing the human phenomenon detailed in these documents.
We're looking at the mechanics of belief. And it is crucial to state up front that the sources we are drawing from cover an incredibly wide spectrum. We have intense theological analyses, deeply personal testimonials, academic critiques, and rigorous sociological studies.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the very language we use. Because according to the sources, if we are talking about entering Islam, using the word conversion isn't actually accurate to their internal theology.
That's right. Within Islamic theology, this process is almost universally referred to as reversion. And this terminology isn't just semantics. It is rooted in a foundational psychological anchor of Islamic doctrine known as fitra.
Fitra. I've seen this translated as an innate nature in the documents. But how does that actually work mechanically?
Well, the doctrine of fitra posits that all human beings are born in a natural innate state of submission to the Creator. In this view, pure, unmediated monotheism is the factory default setting of the human soul.
The factory default setting, I like that phrasing.
Yeah, the theology argues that secondary religious identities, whether that's Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, or even secularism, are viewed as being added later. They are layered on strictly through societal conditioning, geographical inheritance, or parental influence.
Okay, so you're born with the default, and then your environment installs new software over it.
Precisely. So when someone accepts Islam, the internal narrative is that they aren't adopting a foreign new identity. They are shedding the artificial layers of societal conditioning and returning or reverting to their original pristine state.
Wait, hold on, though. If a priest has spent 40 years utterly devoted to the church, running a parish, performing baptisms, telling them they're just reverting, sounds like a massive psychological handwave. I mean, how does a 50-year-old man actually convince his own brain that his entire adult life, his deepest held beliefs, were just societal conditioning? It can't be that simple.
You've hit on the exact friction point that sociologists study. It isn't simple at all, and it certainly isn't instantaneous. This brings us to the cognitive science of religion, or CSR.
CSR, right.
The academic models in your sources actively push back against the Hollywood idea of a single eureka moment. A sudden flash of lightning on the road to Damascus where everything changes in an afternoon. Instead, sociologists describe this entire ordeal as a conversion career.
A conversion career? That makes it sound like a prolonged systemic process, almost like working your way up a corporate ladder of deconstruction.
Because that is exactly how it functions. It's a massive, multi-tiered sociological transition that spans years. You have to remember the mechanics of what religion is to a cleric.
It's their whole world.
Exactly. It isn't just a set of intellectual beliefs. It's a cognitive adaptation that binds their entire community together. A cleric's entire reality, their marriage, their children's standing, their mortgage, is structured around their faith.
So untangling that has to be agonizing.
Agonizing is the perfect word. Deconstructing that requires navigating intense psychological vulnerabilities. And because the trauma of that deconstruction is so severe, the data shows that converts frequently enter a highly specific post-conversion stage. It's known as the zealotry phase.
The zealotry phase, meaning they become hyper-enthusiastic about their new identity.
More than just enthusiastic, they often become profoundly rigidly orthodox. They aggressively defend the global Muslim community, known as the Ummah, against any external criticism.
Well, that makes sense.
And the fascinating mechanism here is that they frequently channel their extensive previous theological training into writing fierce polemics. They try to mathematically dismantle the very faiths they just left.
It makes perfect sense when you think about the psychology of sunk costs. It's not like changing the wallpaper in your living room. It's dynamiting the foundation of your house and rebuilding from scratch while all your neighbors watch in horror.
That is a great analogy.
You have to convince yourself and everyone watching that dynamiting the house was the absolute only logical choice. You have to prove the old house was fundamentally flawed. But here's my question. When you dynamite that house, you lose your entire ecclesiastical community. Your congregation is gone. Your colleagues probably won't return your calls.
You are totally isolated.
Yeah. So how did the concept of the Ummah soften the blow of that massive, devastating social loss?
That is the critical load-bearing function of the Ummah in this psychological reconstruction. The Ummah isn't just a word for other Muslims. It is the concept of a global, borderless, inextricably linked community of believers.
Like a massive support network.
Exactly. When a cleric loses their local congregation in Ohio or London, the narrative of the Ummah instantly reframes their social standing. They are no longer viewed as an apostate, an outcast, or a traitor to their local church.
Right. They're a hero to the new group.
They are instantly embraced as a returning triumphant brother or sister by a global community of nearly 2 billion people. It provides the ultimate sociological safety net. The brain swaps a micro-community for a macro-community to survive the transition.
You lose a parish of 200 people, but you gain a global family of 2 billion. That is incredibly potent. You might be listening to this thinking, well, I don't have a parish, so how does this apply to me? But think about your own social circles. If you changed your deepest political or moral belief tomorrow, who would you lose?
It's a terrifying thought for most people.
It really is. These clerics are showing us the extreme version of what happens when the pursuit of truth costs you your entire social safety net. But this entire reconstruction process has to start somewhere. There has to be a spark, a splinter in the mind that makes a religious leader even look toward the exit door.
And according to your sources, that foundation almost always starts with profound theological friction.
Yes, and nowhere is this more evident than in the massive wave of Christian clerics who have made this transition.
If you look at the sheer numbers in these documents, the Christian exodus is staggering. We are talking about ordained ministers, Catholic priests, highly credentialed theologians.
Across the board.
Across the board. And the craziest part, despite coming from vastly different denominations, Methodist, Catholic, Pentecostal, the cognitive friction centers repeatedly, almost universally, around 3 specific doctrinal hurdles: the Trinity, the concept of original sin, and the mechanics of vicarious atonement.
Let's get into the mechanics of those hurdles, because the testimonies in these sources are gripping. Take Yusuf Estes. He was a former Christian preacher, a music minister, an institutional chaplain in Texas.
A very prominent figure in his circles.
Yeah, and this was a guy who, by his own admission, initially had a deeply hostile, media-driven view of Muslims. He essentially equated them strictly with terrorism and backwardness.
His starting point was absolutely not interfaith curiosity. It was active antagonism.
Exactly. But then he has this forced personal encounter with an Egyptian Muslim businessman. And Estes, being an evangelical preacher, does what evangelical preachers do. He tries to convert him.
Of course.
He tries to explain the Trinity, the Orthodox Christian belief in God, as 3 co-equal, co-eternal persons: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And he uses all the classic apologetic analogies that every Sunday school teacher uses.
The egg and the apple, usually.
Yes. He says, think of an apple. It has skin, flesh, and a core, but it's one apple. Or think of an egg. It has a shell, the egg white, and the yolk, but it's all one egg.
Those are standard pedagogical tools. They are designed to make a divine mystery digestible to a human mind.
Right. But in the course of these debates with this businessman, Estes realizes something terrifying for a man who makes his living explaining God. The analogies fail basic logical scrutiny.
Because they imply division.
Exactly. An eggshell is demonstrably not the egg yolk. They are distinct parts making up a composite whole. If you apply that to God, it implies God is divisible. God is made of parts. And historically, the idea that God has parts means God relies on those parts to exist, which means God isn't the ultimate self-sustaining reality.
It created a severe crisis of faith for him.
It led to profound cognitive dissonance, and that mathematical friction paved the way for the Islamic concept of tawhid.
To understand why that was so appealing, we have to define tawhid. It is the concept of absolute, indivisible monotheism. It is the belief that God is one absolute entity, entirely without parts, partners, or equals.
So no egg analogy needed.
None. God does not manifest in physical forms. God does not divide into persons. For clerics like Estes, who are agonizing over Trinitarian math, trying to reconcile how the Creator exists in three distinct persons while maintaining absolute unity, tawhid operates as a massive theological magnet. It is mathematically clean.
And for Estes, this wasn't seen as adopting a foreign god. He viewed it as the restoration of the original uncorrupted Abrahamic monotheism. The sheer clarity of tawhid completely dismantled his previous worldview. He couldn't unsee the mathematical flaw in his own analogies.
What broke the shell for him?
It shattered it. And the ripple effect was staggering. His entire family, including his devout ordained father, ended up converting.
Estes represents the evangelical debate-driven trajectory. He clashed over logic, but the sources also highlight a completely different mechanism, the intellectual academic trajectory. Consider Dr. Gerald F. Dirks.
Oh, his story is fascinating.
He is a great case study. He was an ordained Methodist minister, but crucially, he holds a Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School.
You don't get much more academically rigorous than that.
Yeah.
That's the Ivy League of theology.
Which is exactly what initiated his conversion career. It was the academic rigor itself that broke his faith. At Harvard, he was subjected to deep exposure regarding the historical evolution of the Bible, specifically a concept called redaction.
Let's pause and explain redaction, because that's a heavy academic term. For our listener, redaction basically means editing, right?
It's editing, but on a generational scale. Redaction criticism is the study of how different authors and editors over centuries compiled, altered, and shaped biblical texts to fit specific theological agendas.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. For instance, realizing that the Gospel of Mark was written first, and then the authors of Matthew and Luke literally copied portions of Mark, but altered the wording to make Jesus appear more divine or to fulfill specific prophecies.
Oh, wow.
When a cleric like Dr. Dirks studies redaction, they are watching the human fingerprints smudge the supposedly divine text. It shatters the illusion of absolute uncorrupted preservation. It created a severe crisis of faith regarding the Bible's pure divine origin.
He went to school to get closer to God and ended up seeing how the sausage was made. And then, in one of the most unexpected twists in all of these sources, his path to Islam doesn't come from another theology class. It comes through Arabian horses.
Yes, the unpredictability of the conversion career is amazing. He was researching the history of the Arabian horse breed, which necessitated interacting closely with Arab Muslims. What struck him wasn't their theology initially, it was their applied sociology.
What do you mean by that?
He saw how their piety, their hospitality, and their daily conduct were seamlessly integrated with their faith. It wasn't just a Sunday activity, it was an omnipresent reality.
But he didn't jump right in. He adopted this bizarre liminal identity first. The sources say he started calling himself an atypical Christian.
An atypical Christian, right?
He was actively performing Islamic ritual prayers, the Salah, physically putting his forehead to the ground. And he was fasting from food and water during the month of Ramadan, all while still claiming to be a Christian minister.
That perfectly illustrates the mechanism of the conversion career. It's a transition phase. Human beings rarely jump across a chasm in one leap. He was testing the theological waters.
Bring it on for size.
Exactly. By adopting the physical rituals, he was allowing his cognition to catch up to his actions. He was seeing how the physical submission aligned with his internal spiritual state before taking the irreversible, socially destructive public step of reciting the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith.
But he eventually did cross that threshold.
He did, and he went on to write extensive interfaith theology, focusing heavily on the historical corruption of biblical texts, using his Harvard training to defend his new home.
Okay, so Estes struggled with the math of the Trinity. Dirks struggled with textual preservation and redaction. But then we have Jennifer Harrell, a former Methodist youth minister. Her friction point was entirely different, and she stated it with such stark, devastating simplicity. She was grappling with the concepts of original sin and vicarious atonement.
Let's define those mechanisms for the listener so we're all on the same page.
Good idea.
Original sin is the orthodox Christian doctrine that all of humanity inherently inherits the guilt and spiritual stain of Adam and Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden. Because of this inherited guilt, humans are inherently broken from birth.
And vicarious atonement.
Vicarious atonement, specifically penal substitution, is the mechanism to fix it. It's the idea that divine justice demands a blood sacrifice to pay for that inherited sin, and Jesus serves as that ultimate punishing sacrifice in place of humanity.
Right? Jesus takes the punishment so you don't have to. And Harold's quote from the sources just cuts right through the theology. She said, "I never understood why Jesus had to die for my sins. I mean, they're my sins." It's such a pure distillation of the problem.
It points to a profound ethical dilemma that many clerics secretly harbor. The idea of inherited guilt, being punished for something an ancestor did, and the necessity of punishing an innocent deity figure to forgive guilty humans, it often creates deep legal and logical discomfort.
It feels like a circumvention of actual justice.
Exactly. It feels like a loophole. Islam counters this Christian paradigm entirely.
Right. There is no original sin in Islam.
None. Going back to the concept of fitra, humans are born entirely sinless. You are a blank slate. You are only accountable for your own conscious actions. And more importantly, Islam teaches direct, unmediated individual accountability coupled with infinite divine mercy, or Rahmah. Yes, in Islamic theology, God forgives sins directly upon sincere repentance. Full stop. There is no prerequisite for a blood sacrifice to balance some cosmic ledger. There is no need for an intercessory priesthood to absolve you.
You don't need to go through a priest, a saint, or a crucified savior to get to the Creator. Former clerics describe this realization as deeply, profoundly liberating.
Because it is a total paradigm shift regarding personal agency, you are moving from a transactional, sacrificial framework to one of direct supplication. You are no longer relying on the cross for salvation. You are relying directly on your own actions and God's mercy. You own your sins, and you own your redemption.
And it isn't just Protestants making this leap. The sources detail Catholic priests too, like Idris Tawfik from the UK. His shift wasn't as strictly academic or debate-driven, it was experiential.
He had a very visual catalyst.
He did. He was visiting Cairo, and he was just floored by the profound, simple devotion of everyday people. He saw an entire society, shopkeepers, taxi drivers, pausing their commerce to prioritize their daily prayers.
Right in the middle of the street.
Yes. The visual impact of seeing ordinary people physically submitting to God in the middle of a busy street contrasted so sharply with the rapid, cynical secularization he was seeing back in the West. He realized the spiritual vitality he was looking for wasn't in his church, it was on the streets of Egypt. He resigned from the priesthood.
And we also see incredible communal impacts when these leaders shift. Look at Ibrahim Richmond, a former South African priest. The data shows his personal conversion to Islam wasn't isolated.
Because he was leader.
Exactly. He was the spiritual anchor of his community. His conversion triggered a massive cascade effect, resulting in the communal conversion of his entire congregation, numbering in the thousands. When the shepherd moves, sometimes the flock follows.
Thousands of people. That is wild.
It is. And the sources list so many others. Martin John Y. Popo, a former Lutheran archbishop. Vyacheslav Polosin, an archpriest of the Russian Orthodox Church. Khadijah Sue Watson, a former professor of divinity. Kenneth L. Jenkins, a former Pentecostal minister.
So what does this all mean? When we look at this Christian exodus, the through line is a rejection of complexity. It's a shift from a highly complex mediatory theology, where you need priests, saints, and a triune God, to something incredibly direct and mathematically singular.
It's a streamlining of faith.
Exactly. But here is where we pivot. Christianity offered salvation through a mediator, which these clerics rejected for direct access. But what if your friction point isn't how you access God, but who is allowed to access God in the first place? That brings us to the Jewish texts, where the magnet isn't just monotheism, but universalism.
That's a crucial sociological distinction. Conversions from Judaism to Islam are historically very complex, and statistically, they are much less frequent today than Christian conversions.
Right, the numbers are much smaller.
They are, but when they do occur, the primary sociological and theological driver is often the rejection of ethnocentric exclusivity.
Ethnocentric exclusivity, let's translate that for our listener. That means the idea of a chosen people.
Exactly. It is the friction caused by the doctrine that full integration into the divine covenant is heavily tied to bloodline, tribe, and being born Jewish. Let's look at the modern testimony of a former Orthodox practitioner identified in the sources as Selahaddin.
His story really highlighted this.
His departure from Judaism was heavily influenced by this exact friction point. He looked at the vastness of the universe and reasoned that if a religion is truly ordained by the creator of all things, it must be inherently universally accessible to all of humanity, regardless of their genetic bloodline or their geographical birthplace.
He couldn't reconcile the concept of a limitless universal God with a restricted birthright-based covenant. To him, God was too big to belong to just one tribe. And he found the answer to that friction in Islam's global demographics.
The diversity of it.
Yeah, the fact that the Ummah spans every race, nationality, and language seamlessly. Anyone can enter the covenant instantly by saying one sentence.
We see a few modern figures in the data reflecting this specific trajectory, like Moshe Kravitsky, a reported former rabbi in Dagestan, and Yosef Cohen from Brooklyn.
Though the sources mention Cohen is pretty controversial.
Very controversial. Cohen's rabbinical credentials are fiercely debated by his former Hasidic community, which, is a common defense mechanism we see communities deploy when a high-profile member leaves. But his testimony centers on that same search for universal truth. But where the Jewish transitions get truly fascinating and, frankly, heavily disputed is when we look at the historical heavyweights.
Yes, the historical accounts in these sources are wild.
Yeah.
You have Abdullah bin Salam, a highly prominent rabbi in Medina during the very time of the Prophet Muhammad.
A direct contemporary.
Yes. The traditions say he actually recognized the prophet based on specific, uncorrupted descriptions he had read in his own Torah. He voluntarily converted, which immediately and completely alienated him from his tight-knit community.
And then there's Samuel of Morocco.
Right, a 12th century rabbi who converted and then utilized his deep knowledge of Jewish law to write highly complex polemics. He was trying to mathematically prove to his former peers that the abrogation of Jewish law by Islam was a divine necessity.
But this raises a massive academic red flag, and it's a caveat explicitly detailed in your sources. We cannot treat all of these historical medieval conversions with the same empirical weight as a modern voluntary video testimonial on YouTube.
Yeah, you definitely can't.
The historiography here is intensely fraught.
Fraud is putting it mildly.
Yeah.
The sources highlight some major historiographical flaws. You've got Sabbatai Zevi, an incredibly famous rabbi, and a self-proclaimed messiah in the 17th century with thousands of followers. He famously converted to Islam, but it wasn't exactly a spiritual awakening.
No, it was pure, unadulterated survival. He was captured by the Ottoman Empire in 1666 and brought before the Sultan. He was given a very stark, very simple choice: convert to Islam immediately or be executed.
Yeah, he chose to put on the turban to keep his head.
Exactly. And then there's the fierce historical dispute over Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher, also known as Rambam. Maimonides is a towering figure in Jewish thought.
He's legendary.
He is arguably one of the most prolific and influential Torah scholars of the entire Middle Ages. Now, some Muslim chroniclers historically claim that Maimonides converted to Islam and was seen voluntarily praying in mosques.
But modern historians don't buy that, right?
No, they heavily dispute this. They argue that any conversion was either entirely feigned under the brutal threat of the Almohad invasions in Al-Andalus, who were forcing Jews to convert or die, or more likely, it was completely fabricated after the fact by later Islamic polemicists.
Just made up entirely.
Probably. Why? Because Maimonides' private writings, preserved by his followers, remain highly critical of Islamic theology.
Which makes total sense from a propaganda perspective. Medieval historians, whether Islamic, Christian, or Jewish, had a massive vested political interest in claiming that high-ranking leaders of rival faiths were converting to their side. It legitimized their empires. It proved their God was winning.
It was PR for empires.
So I have to ask you as an expert, how do historians actually separate genuine spiritual paradigm shifts from pure political survival in these medieval accounts?
It is incredibly difficult and often inconclusive. Historians have to cross-reference public declarations with private letters, like with Maimonides. They have to analyze the level of political coercion present in the environment. Were there forced conversion edicts in place?
Looking for the sword behind the curtain.
Right. And most importantly, they look at whether the individual maintained their new faith once they moved out of that hostile territory. If someone converts in a hostile empire and then immediately reverts to Judaism the second they cross the border into a safe zone, the initial conversion was clearly coerced.
That makes perfect sense.
It's exactly why modern sociologists rely much more heavily on contemporary, voluntary testimonials where the threat of state execution isn't a factor.
Right, you can't measure the truth of a belief with a sword to someone's neck.
Hmm.
So if transitioning from Christianity is largely about clarifying the math of monotheism, and Judaism is about expanding salvation to universalism, what happens when the starting point isn't even an Abrahamic faith? What happens when a cleric is dealing with Eastern traditions, where the very concept of time and reality is completely different?
This is where we see the most massive cognitive leap in the entire data set. We are talking about the psychological mechanics of moving from pantheism, the belief that God is everything, or idolatry, or non-theistic cyclical cosmologies, to a strict linear Abrahamic monotheism.
Let's break that down for the listener. A cyclical cosmology versus a linear one. Think of it like a video game.
Okay, I like where this is going.
In many Eastern traditions, existence is cyclical. Think of reincarnation, the wheel of samsara. Time is a circle. You live, you die, you are reborn based on karma. It is an infinite loop. In Abrahamic faiths like Islam, time is a strict line.
A definite start and end.
Right. There is a definitive creation, a single lifespan, a definitive death, a singular massive day of judgment, and then an eternal hereafter.
Right.
Moving from the wheel to the line fundamentally alters how an individual perceives moral accountability and the entire purpose of their existence.
Going back to your video game analogy, a cyclical religion is like playing a game on an infinite loop. If you mess up, you just respawn and try again in the next life.
Exactly.
But a linear religion is like playing in permadeath mode. You get one life. Every single choice has final, eternal stakes. Let's look at how this plays out with the Hindu priests mentioned in the sources. We have Sushil Kumar Sharma, an unnamed Brahmin priest, and Brother Bobby.
The Brahmin priest's testimony is particularly striking.
Very much so. He was raised in a strict, inherited lineage of Hindu priests. It was his birthright. But he struggled deeply with two mechanical things: the rigid, inherited stratification of the caste system and the physical concept of idol worship.
And when he was finally exposed to Islamic theology, he didn't view it as just trading one cultural mythos for another. He viewed it as a triumph of rationality over superstition.
Just saw the logic in it.
Yeah, the philosophical proofs of a singular, unseen, all-powerful creator dismantled his reliance on polytheistic rituals. He didn't have to bathe a statue or offer it food anymore. He found profound intellectual peace in the sheer, unadulterated logic of Allah.
And Brother Bobby spent decades, intensely studying Hindu scriptures, trying to find the ultimate truth before finally concluding that Islam offered superior spiritual clarity. But the shift from Buddhism is even more distinct. Firdaus Wang, a Chinese former Buddhist, talked about his friction with the elusive concept of nirvana.
We need to define nirvana to understand his friction, right?
We do. Nirvana is often described as the ultimate spiritual goal in Buddhism, which is the cessation of desire, the extinguishing of the self to finally escape the painful cycle of rebirth.
Sort of dissolving.
Yes. For some practitioners, this concept can eventually feel philosophically abstract, void of personality, or lacking in tangible moral resolution for the injustices of the world.
Wang found that the Islamic doctrines, the promise of a tangible hereafter, a physical resurrection of the body, a definitive day of judgment where every atom of good and evil is weighed, they offered far more psychological resolution.
There is ultimate moral accountability.
Yes, the tyrant is punished, the victim is rewarded, definitively, forever.
What's fascinating here is the human psychological need for finality. For these clerics, the linear nature of Islam provides a definitive resolution to the problem of evil and injustice that cyclical, infinite loop models sometimes struggle to satisfy on a tangible human level. You aren't just dissolving into the universe, you are standing before a judge who promises perfect justice.
It changes the weight of every footstep you take. But regardless of whether these clerics come from a Methodist church, an Orthodox synagogue, or a Buddhist temple, the sources indicate that they all eventually collide with the exact same catalyst.
The text of the Quran itself.
Yes, the textual magnetism. It's not just that they had doubts, it's that the Quran specifically answered those exact doubts. The sources break down specific Quranic verses that act as cognitive triggers. They mathematically resolve the pre-existing scriptural friction these clerics were carrying.
Let's look at the heavy hitters, starting with the verses of monotheism.
The prime example here is Surah Al-Ikhlas, chapter 112. It is incredibly short, but devastatingly effective. It reads, "Say, He is Allah, who is one, Allah, the eternal refuge. He neither begets nor is born, nor is there to him any equivalent."
That is the exact verse that shattered Yusuf Esta's Trinitarian struggle with the egg analogy.
Because there's no wiggle room.
None. It's a definitive, bulletproof theological constitution. No parts, no offspring, no physical incarnation, no equivalence. It is an absolute firewall against polytheism. You cannot fit a trinity into that verse.
And then you have Ayat al-Kursi, known as the throne verse, which is chapter 2, verse 255. This is revered for its majestic, sweeping description of God's sovereign power, for a cleric seeking a profound ontological definition of the divine.
Let's translate ontological for the listener. We're talking about the very nature of being, what God actually is.
Right, the nature of God's existence. Ayat al-Kursi defines a God entirely free of human anthropomorphism. It says God doesn't sleep, God doesn't slumber, God doesn't rest on the seventh day.
Which is huge for clerics who struggle with the biblical depictions of God wrestling with Jacob or regretting creation. This verse is unparalleled in establishing supreme, flawless majesty.
But it's not all just grand cosmic sovereignty looking down from a throne. There are verses of incredible, terrifying intimacy. Surah chapter 50, verse 16. And we have already created man, and know what his soul whispers to him, and we are closer to him than his jugular vein.
That specific imagery, closer than the jugular vein, is a profound psychological comfort, but it also fundamentally destroys the need for a church.
It deletes the middleman.
Exactly. If God is closer to you than the blood pumping through your own neck, you fundamentally do not need a priest. You do not need a saint to intercede for you. You don't need a confessional booth. It dismantles the entire necessity of an ecclesiastical hierarchy in a single anatomical sentence.
And that concept is reinforced by Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 152. So remember me, I will remember you, in verse 186. I answer the prayer of the supplicant when he calls to me. It's a guarantee of unmediated, direct communication. No middleman.
But for Christian clergy specifically, there is one chapter that serves as the ultimate indispensable bridge, Surah Maryam, chapter 19.
Surah Maryam is structurally vital to the Christian conversion career. When a Christian pastor converts, they don't have to abandon Jesus, who is known as Isa in Arabic. In fact, they're commanded to love him, but they have to recalibrate him.
How so?
Surah Maryam meticulously details the virgin birth. It deeply honors the profound piety of Mary, who actually has more mentions in the Quran than in the New Testament, and it openly acknowledges the miracles of Jesus.
But, and this is the key mechanism, it systematically strips away all the Hellenistic accretions of divinity.
Let's explain what that means. Hellenistic accretions are the concepts from Greek philosophy, like demigods or the logos becoming flesh, that slowly merged with early Christian thought over centuries.
Surah Maryam strips all that Greek philosophy away.
It does. It recalibrates Jesus from the incarnate Son of God back to a pure, infallible human prophet and Messiah. The sources note that this specific surah is uniquely effective because it provides a familiar, deeply loved narrative, but locks it within a strictly non-compromising monotheistic framework.
It softens the landing. You don't lose Jesus, you just understand him correctly.
The Quran also appeals to different intellectual temperaments within the clergy. For the mystical seekers, those drawn to philosophy or esoteric Sufism, there is the massive allure of Surah An-Nur, the verse of light. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. His light is like a niche in which there is a lamp.
It's highly allegorical, poetic, proving the text has profound, multi-layered spiritual depth beyond just strict law.
But if you need absolute, stark, terrifying scriptural authority, you read Surah Ghafir, chapter 40, verse 70. Those who deny the book and that with which we sent our messengers, they are going to know. It's an eschatological warning, meaning it is a definitive threat about the end of the world and final judgment. It covers all the bases.
It really does.
But as I was reading this section of the sources, I hit a massive contradiction. I mean, an absolute paradox that the apologetic literature seems to ignore.
You are referring to the untranslatability paradox.
Yes. Let's talk about this. Islamic orthodoxy universally, aggressively insists that the true miracle of the Quran is linguistic. Its divine eloquence, its rhyming prose, its grammatical perfection can only be fully understood and experienced in classical Arabic. If you translate it, it ceases to be the Quran. It's just an interpretation.
That is the orthodox stance, yes.
Yet almost all the modern clerics we just talked about, Dirks, Estes, Harold, Tawfiq, none of them read or spoke classical Arabic when they converted. They converted based on reading rudimentary, clunky English paperback translations. So my question to you is, if the miracle is inexorably bound to the Arabic language, why is a paperback English translation triggering the ultimate paradigm shift in these highly educated leaders?
It is a fascinating sociological tension between theology and reality. The Orthodox theology insists the primary miracle is the Arabic language itself. but the sociological data proves that the semantic meaning, the raw ideas themselves, are robust enough to survive the degradation of translation and completely alter a cleric's worldview.
The ideas are just that strong.
Exactly. The concept of Tahed, the promise of direct accountability, the liberation from a priestly class. These ideas are so philosophically potent that they act as the catalyst, even when the linguistic miracle is completely obscured by an English translation. The ideas are the heavy lifters, not just the poetry.
That is wild. The math of the theology is so clean that it works in any language. But speaking of proofs and miracles, there is another textual argument used heavily in modern conversions that is incredibly effective at getting people through the door, but the sources show it is fiercely debated even among Muslims themselves.
You are referring to Ijaz al-Ummi, the doctrine of the scientific miracles of the Quran.
Right. This is the modern claim that the Quran contains highly specific, advanced scientific data that was absolutely impossible for an unlettered 7th century person in the Arabian desert to know. We are talking about verses that supposedly detail the microscopic stages of human embryology, the movement of tectonic plates, descriptions of the Big Bang, the expanding universe, and the extraterrestrial meteoric origin of iron.
For secularly educated people or medically trained individuals, this is a massive, massive magnet. It sounds like definitive proof.
It is presented as empirical proof of divine origin. The apologetic framework argues that only a supreme creator, viewing the universe from the outside, could possess such macroscopic and microscopic knowledge centuries before the invention of the telescope or the microscope.
This narrative was heavily institutionalized in global dawah, or proselytization literature, starting in the 1970s. It was largely popularized by the French physician Maurice Bucaille and his incredibly famous book, The Bible, the Quran, and Science. It became the go-to argument for converting rationalists.
And we have to impartially relay what the sources say about the pushback on this, because the pushback is intense and multi-layered. First, you have the external secular critiques. Authors like the ex-Muslim Majid Ukacha argue these aren't miracles. They are actually inaccuracies that prove a human origin.
Right. He points to perceived mathematical impossibilities in the Quranic inheritance laws, where fractions allegedly don't add up to 100% without human workarounds.
Critics also argue that the embryological stages described in the Quran suspiciously mirror the pre-existing, slightly flawed medical texts of the Greek physician Galen, which were widely circulated in the Middle East at the time.
And regarding cosmology, external critics note that spherical Earth models aren't a modern invention. They date back to the Greek mathematician Eratosthenes around 250 BC. And the idea that ancient civilizations didn't know iron came from space is false. Ancient Egyptians literally called it the metal of heaven because they occasionally mined it directly from fallen meteorites.
But honestly, the most fascinating part of the sources isn't the external atheist critique. Atheists is always going to critique Scripture. The fascinating part is the immense pushback from within Orthodox Islamic academia itself.
Yes, there is a rapidly growing internal resistance from highly credentialed Islamic scholars against using the scientific miracles narrative at all. Scholars like Dr. Sohaib Said and Ahmad S. Dalal argue that this entire apologetic strategy is fundamentally intellectually bankrupt and, ironically, incredibly dangerous to the preservation of the faith.
How so? Why would proving your book with science be dangerous?
Because of the very nature of what science is. Science is inherently fluid. It is entirely based on the concept of falsifiability. Scientific theories change, they are updated, they are refined, and often they are completely debunked by new data.
Right, it's always evolving.
Exactly. If you retrofit an ever-changing, fluid scientific theory onto an eternal, immutable religious text to prove its divinity, you are tying a rock to a sinking ship. What happens when the science changes tomorrow?
Oh, wow. I see the trap. If you say, the Quran is true because it perfectly aligns with string theory, and then physicists disprove string theory in 10 years. Well, the Quran's perceived infallibility is suddenly undermined by the very tool you use to prop it up. You've given science authority over the Scripture.
Exactly. You've made science the judge of God's word. These scholars argue that treating the Quran as a textbook of biology, embryology, or astrophysics fundamentally degrades its primary intended function. The Quran is meant to be hidayah, a book of moral, ethical, and spiritual guidance.
Turning it into a scientific encyclopedia distracts from its actual purpose, which is teaching humans how to live, not how cells divide.
It is a massive data contradiction. Statistically, it's one of the most effective tools for modern conversion, getting highly educated doctors and engineers through the door. But academically, it's one of the most vulnerable, fragile frameworks you could possibly use.
But this debate over science, theology, and translation, it doesn't happen in a vacuum anymore. It doesn't happen in a library in Cairo. It happens online. Which brings us to the infrastructure driving today's conversions.
The digital Dawa ecosystem. The modern conversion experience, especially for high-profile clerics, has been completely revolutionized. It is no longer confined to clandestine, dangerous meetings in coffee shops or physical mosques where you might be seen by your congregation.
Which used to be a huge risk.
A massive risk. Now it relies heavily on a sophisticated, highly optimized, globalized digital infrastructure.
We mapped out the platforms from the sources, and it's basically a full-service theological supply chain. If a cleric wants to read primary texts without a Muslim knowing they're looking, they go to Quran.com or Sunnah.com. Unmediated, instant access in 50 languages.
It's all right there.
If they hit a theological roadblock and need jurisprudential answers, they hit Islam QA. If they want high-level Ivy League academic defense to counter Christian polemics, they look at institutes like Yaqeen or Zaytuna College.
And this digital infrastructure provides something that was historically utterly impossible for a public religious figure: total anonymity.
Yes, this is the game changer. YouTube channels like Blogging Theology or Merciful Servant allow high-ranking clerics to explore a rival faith in complete darkroom secret. A pastor in Texas can watch rigorous 3-hour comparative religion debates for years behind a screen.
They can intellectually test the waters.
They can wrestle with Tawhid and deconstruct the Trinity without risking their job, their reputation, or their family standing until they are absolutely 100% ready to make the leap.
And when they finally do make that leap and dynamite their house, there are algorithms and organizations waiting to catch them. The digital space has created support networks like Embrace, Reverts, and Rabata, which act as vital safety nets.
So they don't just freefall.
Exactly. They provide step-by-step guidance, mentorship, and community, effectively replacing the cleric's lost ecclesiastical community with a structured digital Islamic support system. The transition is managed algorithmically.
But as we look at all this digital data, all these YouTube testimonials, the sources introduce a critical limitation, a massive blind spot in the apologetic literature.
The bidirectional flow.
Yes, the Dawa organizations present this massive one-way highway of Christian and Jewish clerics driving toward Islam, seeing the light of Tawhid. But the data captures the exact opposite happening too: reverse defections. Devout, highly trained Muslims converting to Christianity.
This is vital for any objective sociological analysis. We cannot ignore the phenomenon of bidirectional conversion. The highway goes both ways.
Exactly. We have to impartially look at both sides of the coin because it reveals so much about human nature. The sources detail Pastor Hisham, who was raised as a devout conservative Muslim. He reported that despite following all the rules, he found his life deeply lacking joy and purpose within the strict framework of Islamic rituals.
The direct accountability felt burdensome to him.
Rather than liberating, yeah. He converted to Christianity, faced severe, life-threatening persecution in his home country, sought asylum in Canada, and now runs an online church for over 500 Arab Christian converts. He built his own digital safety net.
We also see accounts like Pastor Naim Fazal, raised in a Muslim family in the Middle East, who describes a profound supernatural encounter with Jesus Christ that led to his instantaneous conversion. A complete bypass of the intellectual conversion career for a mystical experience.
Wow, so no prolonged deconstruction for him.
No, just an immediate shift. Or look at Pastor Sam, who fled intense Iranian persecution to plant underground Christian churches, and Ahmed, a former Islamic extremist who was violently opposed to the West, who converted after a vivid, life-altering dream of Jesus handing him a Bible.
The psychological symmetry here is just profound. Think about it. The exact same psychological drivers are cited by both sides. When Christian clerics like Dr. Dirks or Yusuf Estes move to Islam, they explicitly state they are seeking inner peace, doctrinal clarity, and a direct, authentic divine connection.
And the reverse is true as well.
Yes. When Muslim clerics and devout practitioners move to Christianity, they cite the exact same desires. They are seeking inner peace, relational clarity with God, and a direct, authentic divine connection. It's the same human engine, just driving in a different direction.
What's fascinating here from a sociological standpoint is that human psychology remains intensely consistent regardless of the theological direction. The quest for absolute truth, the burning need for spiritual fulfillment, often mirrors the exact shape of the existential void the individual is trying to fill.
That's a great way to put it.
If you feel suffocated by complexity, you run toward the simplicity of Tawhid. If you feel suffocated by strict laws, you run toward the grace of the cross. Institutional narratives, whether Christian or Islamic, will naturally curate only the unidirectional flow that supports their exclusive truth claims. They only show you the highlight reel of people joining their team.
But the human reality captured in these sources is a messy, bidirectional, beautiful search for meaning.
It really is.
Okay, pulling back from the digital landscape, the medieval history, the intense debates over science and translations, what is the ultimate takeaway for you listening to this mountain of sources? To summarize, the conversion of a religious leader isn't just a swap of dogma. It is a profound, agonizing, and beautiful sociological reconstruction of the self.
It's rebuilding your entire world.
Whether a pastor is pulled by the flawless mathematical logic of Tawhid, or softened by the reverence of Surah Maryam, or shielded by the anonymity of digital dawah, it is the ultimate human quest for meaning. It's tearing down the only house you've ever known to build something you believe, with every fiber of your being, is eternally true.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, drawing from the reality of this new digital ecosystem we just discussed. For all of human history, religion was largely a geographical inheritance. You believed what your village believed.
Because that was all you had access to.
Exactly. But if the internet allows religious leaders to secretly test drive rival theologies behind a screen for years, with unmediated access to every sacred text and apologetic argument ever written, are we entering an era where inherited religious hierarchy is dead?
That's a profound question.
Perhaps religion is no longer a geographical inheritance dictated by where you were born. We might be moving toward a perpetual open-source marketplace of ideas, where every single believer is no longer just a passive follower of their parents' faith, but a lifelong, active investigator of the truth.
Jazakallah khair. May Allah reward you with goodness for spending your valuable time listening to us.